Dear viewers, I hope you'll support us by simply subscribing to our channel. Also, like, share, and comment, and let me know where you're watching this video from. My name is Ethan. I'm 28 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I've carried a silent title in my family, the failure. It wasn't something they said outright at first, not in so many words. But I could feel it in the smirks tossed across the table at family gatherings, in the half-whispered comments I'd overhear when they thought I wasn't listening, and in the overly polite nods that came whenever I talked about what I wanted to do with my life. I grew up in a household where appearances meant everything, where success wasn't judged by how happy you were or how fulfilled you felt, but by the size of your paycheck, the weight of your job title, and the bragging rights parents could parade in front of others. And according to them, I always fell short. Back in school, I wasn't the cousin who won trophies as the star athlete. Nor was I the straight-A scholar my older brother, Michael, seemed born to be. And I definitely wasn't the musical genius my sister, Emily, was constantly praised for being. I was the kid staying up late into the night fiddling with computers, sketching odd ideas into notebooks, and imagining things that didn't exist yet. For me, it felt like exploration. To my family, it looked like wasted time. But the moment that truly sealed my label in their eyes came during my grandmother's funeral when I was 24. Grief already pressed hard on me that day because she had been the one person who believed in me without conditions. She was the one who slipped me a little cash when I was broke, whispered encouragement when others laughed at me, and told me she saw something in me no one else seemed to recognize. At the funeral, I thought maybe I'd finally have the chance to stand up and speak about her, to tell everyone what she meant to me. But just as I rose from my seat, my uncle, James, my father's older brother, grabbed me with a grip that felt more like a clamp than a hand. Leaning close, his breath heavy with coffee and cigarettes, he whispered words I'll never forget, words etched into my mind like scars: "You'll always be the family failure. Don't embarrass us by speaking." I froze in that moment, my throat suddenly dry, my palms slick with sweat. I wanted to push back, to argue, to scream at him that he had no right to silence me at my own grandmother's funeral. But instead, I swallowed my anger, sat down with legs trembling, and watched while others, many of whom hadn't even visited her in years, stood up and gave shallow, empty speeches. My throat ached with the words I never said. That day marked me deeply, burning me with humiliation, anger, and the sting of being silenced at the exact moment my voice mattered most. I carried it like a weight. On the ride home, I stared blankly out the car window while my parents made small talk in the front seats. They never asked why I hadn't spoken, never noticed the storm inside me. To them, I had simply played the part they expected, the quiet, invisible disappointment. But here's what they didn't know: I didn't let myself forget. I used those words as fuel. While they carried on, smug and secure in their certainty that Ethan would never achieve anything, I buried myself in the one thing that made me feel alive, building something of my own. I worked brutal hours, sleeping on an air mattress in a tiny apartment with peeling paint and broken heating. I ate cheap ramen more times than I'd like to admit. Friends drifted away because I was always too busy, but I refused to quit. Every failure, every rejection, every mocking sneer from relatives at holiday gatherings added fuel to the fire. Those dinners were their own battlefield. I remember one Thanksgiving not long after the funeral. I showed up late, still on the phone with a potential investor, and as soon as I sat down, my uncle laughed loudly enough for everyone to hear. "So, Ethan, still chasing your little projects? When are you going to get a real job?" My cousin snickered. My parents stayed silent. I wanted to throw my fork across the room, but I forced myself to smile and muttered something about still working on it. Every family event blurred into the same cycle, the same questions, the same digs, the same suffocating certainty that they had already decided who I was. My uncle, in particular, seemed to relish it. He slapped me on the back too hard, mocked my clothes, asked if I was still broke. I bit down on my tongue until it nearly bled because I had a secret he didn't know: I had a plan. And then, 2 years later, everything shifted. The startup they all dismissed as some silly hobby was acquired. And not for some small payout either, it sold for $6.1 million. I'll never forget sitting in the lawyer's office, staring at the contract as disbelief washed over me. It was real. I wasn't the failure. I wasn't the disappointment. I had built something, and someone had finally seen the value in it. At first, I told no one. I wanted to savor the victory privately, to sit in the quiet satisfaction of proving them all wrong. I moved into a better apartment, bought a car that didn't rattle once it hit 60, and for the first time in my adult life, I breathed without constant financial fear crushing my chest. And then, out of nowhere, he appeared. On a Saturday morning, I heard a knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, but when I opened it, there he was, my uncle, James, wearing a too-tight polo, his smile wide but hollow, not reaching his eyes. He stretched out his hand like we were old friends. "Ethan, my boy," he said, his voice dripping with fake warmth. "I heard the good news. Thought I'd come by to congratulate you." I froze in place, the memory of his whisper at the funeral roaring back through my head. The grip he'd had on my arm, the sharp sting of his words, "Failure. Don't embarrass us." And now here he stood, smiling as if none of it had ever occurred, as though he hadn't spent years tearing me down in front of anyone who would listen. I didn't reach for his hand. I didn't move at all. I only stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest, because in that instant, one truth burned clear: I knew this was just the beginning. When I didn't return the gesture, my uncle gave a short, awkward laugh, like he thought he could brush off my refusal. He lowered his arm and leaned sideways, craning his neck to peer into my apartment as if it were his right. I shifted to block his view, but his eyes were already darting around, scanning the furniture, the framed art on the walls, the upgraded kitchen appliances. His grin spread wider, though his gaze was sharp with calculation rather than any real warmth. "Looks like things are going well for you," he remarked, his voice deliberately casual. "Really?" I hadn't invited him in yet. He brushed past me anyway with a pat on my shoulder, striding straight into my living room and settling on the couch like he owned it. My jaw clenched, but I shut the door behind him, partly because I didn't want the neighbors overhearing whatever was about to unfold. "So, Ethan," he began, lounging back with his arms stretched wide across the cushions. $6 million, huh? That's incredible. Who would have thought? All those late nights glued to the computer actually paid off." He gave a chuckle, shaking his head like it was some funny twist of fate, as if years of sacrifice and relentless work were nothing more than luck. Forcing myself to remain steady, I sat in the armchair opposite. "Yeah, it's been a long road," I said, keeping my tone level. He nodded knowingly, then leaned forward, clasping his hands as if ready to bestow wisdom. "You know, the family's proud of you. Really proud. We always knew you had potential. Took you a while, but at last you proved us right." His words burned through me. Beneath the armrest, my fists tightened. He wasn't acknowledging my success. He was framing it as though I had finally lived up to expectations they'd never honestly believed I could reach. It was as if every year of mockery and dismissal had been rewritten in his memory as some form of tough love that had motivated me to achieve this. Then he dropped his real reason for being there. "Listen, Ethan," he said, lowering his voice as though confiding in me. "Your cousin Ryan's about to start college, and tuition isn't cheap. He's a smart kid, got a bright future. You'd be doing the family proud if you chipped in a little. Think of it as investing in the next generation." There it was, the first request. My stomach twisted, but I forced a neutral expression. "College is expensive," I said flatly. "I'm sure Ryan will figure it out." His smile flickered. James quickly recovered. Of course. But you know, family helps family, and honestly, you can afford it now. It's not like it would hurt you." I didn't reply. Silence filled the room, punctuated only by the ticking clock on the wall. He shifted in his seat, uneasy but unwilling to stop. "You need to understand," he pressed, his tone sharpening. "Your success reflects on all of us. When people hear you sold a company for millions, they don't just see you, they see the family name. That kind of success ought to benefit everyone." Once again, the same old story. My accomplishments didn't belong to me. They belonged to them, the very people who had sneered at me, silenced me at my grandmother's funeral, laughed at every stumble. Now they wanted to claim the reward. The following weeks only proved how bad it would get. News of my success spread faster than I imagined. Relatives I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly remembered my number. Messages arrived, starting with half-hearted congratulations, but always twisting into requests for loans, investments, or handouts. My aunt left a voicemail explaining her roof needed repairs and how it would mean the world if I covered it. A cousin sent me an email with a link to a used car he wanted, even attaching the price as if I'd transfer the money without question. At family dinners, the atmosphere shifted completely. Gone were the jokes at my expense. Now they displayed me like a prize. "This is Ethan," my uncle boasted proudly one Thanksgiving, "the genius who made millions before 30. He said it with pride, but his eyes glimmered with the same cold calculation. He wasn't proud of me. He was proud of what he thought he could extract. That year, they sat me at the head of the table, a spot normally reserved for him. It wasn't respect. It was strategy. I was their golden goose. My opinions mattered, but only if they aligned with their benefit. When I didn't volunteer to foot the bill for the holiday feast, I caught the whispers, the sidelong glances. My uncle's voice carried its old edge again as he toasted generosity, raising his glass to clink mine with deliberate weight. Every time I tried to share anything real, my life beyond money, the hard work, the failures, the lessons, they cut me off, turning the conversation back to what I could give. To them, I wasn't Ethan anymore. I was a walking bank account. The final straw of that season came one night when I returned home to find an envelope shoved beneath my door. Inside was a letter in my uncle's handwriting. It wasn't dressed up as a request. It was a list, names, items, amounts, like I was their treasurer. At the bottom, underlined twice, was a single note: "We're counting on you. Don't let us down." My chest tightened with fury and disbelief as I sat at the kitchen table, staring at it while my pulse thundered. All those years of being mocked, silenced, dismissed, it felt like they had returned, just wearing a new mask. I wasn't the failure anymore, but I still wasn't a person. My hand crushed the paper into a ball, knuckles white with rage. And for the first time in years, the thought came, maybe it was time to stop choking down my words. That letter should have been the peak of it, the outrageous demand that woke me up completely. But in truth, it was only the warm-up. The real betrayal was waiting, biding its time until it could burst through my door in a way I couldn't ignore or dismiss as just family being family. It happened 3 months later. By then, the constant calls and messages had slowed, not because of respect, but because I'd stopped answering. I chose silence over manipulation, hoping maybe they'd finally take the hint and back off. I was wrong. On a Tuesday afternoon, the phone rang. It was my bank. The voice on the other end was professional, but laced with unease. "Mr. Carter," the woman said, "we just wanted to confirm a transfer request that came through your account this morning. It's a fairly large sum, and given the recipient's details, our fraud detection system flagged it." My stomach dropped. "What transfer?" I asked. She read off the amount, $145,000, and the recipient, my cousin Ryan. My throat went dry. "I didn't authorize that," I said firmly. The woman hesitated. "That's what we suspected, but the request was unusual. It came with a notarized document attached, apparently signed by you, granting your uncle, James Carter, limited authority over certain transactions." I felt the blood drain from my face. My uncle, my own flesh and blood, had forged documents to access my money. I asked the bank to email me copies of everything. And when the files hit my inbox minutes later, I stared at the PDF, my chest tight. There it was, my name, my signature, clumsily imitated, not even close to the way I actually signed. And beneath it, legal-looking language that clearly gave my uncle the right to allocate resources for family obligations. It wasn't just manipulation anymore. It was theft, deliberate, calculated. He had taken his entitled narrative that my money belonged to the family and pushed it to its logical extreme. I called him immediately, my hands shaking so hard I almost dropped the phone. He picked up on the third ring, his voice sickeningly cheerful. "Ethan, good to hear from you, son. How's everything going?" "You forged my signature," I said flatly, my voice colder than I'd ever heard it. There was a pause. Then he sighed, as if I were being unreasonable. "Now, don't be dramatic. It was just paperwork. I figured you wouldn't mind. Not with all that money sitting there. $145,000 is nothing to you now, Ethan. Nothing. And Ryan needs it. He's the future of this family." My vision blurred with rage. "You had no right," I spat. "No right to touch a cent of mine." "You're missing the point," he snapped back, his mask slipping. "Everything you have, it reflects on all of us. You think you did this alone? You think without this family you'd be anywhere? You should be grateful. And if you won't help willingly, then sometimes family has to make those decisions for you." I hung up before I said something I couldn't take back. My whole body was trembling, adrenaline surging. I sat there in the dim light of my living room, the betrayal hitting me in waves. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about control, about erasing my independence, my autonomy, my identity, just as he had tried to do at my grandmother's funeral when he silenced me. Back then, it was my voice. Now, it was my success. The next day, I went to see my parents, hoping for some kind of support. But when I explained what had happened, my father rubbed his temple and said, "Maybe you should have just given him the money, Ethan. It would have avoided all this trouble." My mother nodded, adding, "He's your uncle. He's done a lot for this family. You should try to understand where he's coming from." I stared at them in disbelief, my chest aching. "He forged my signature. He tried to steal from me," I said, my voice rising, but they just sat there, silent, as if that detail didn't matter, as if I was the one making things complicated. That was the moment something broke inside me. The realization that not only had my uncle betrayed me, but my own parents would stand behind him, rationalizing his theft as family duty. It was like the ground had opened beneath me, exposing just how alone I really was in this web of blood ties and obligations. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every insult, every dismissal, every time they'd laughed at me across a dinner table. I thought of my grandmother, the only one who had believed in me, and how furious she would have been if she knew what they had done. My jaw ached from clenching it so hard, and then, slowly, my rage started to crystallize into something else, a cold, deliberate clarity. I knew I couldn't keep swallowing my words. I knew I couldn't let this betrayal stand. But I also knew I couldn't lash out blindly. If I was going to respond, it had to be careful, precise, something that would finally shatter the smug certainty with which they treated me as both failure and resource. Because this wasn't just about money. This was war. The weeks after discovering the forged signature were some of the hardest of my life. On the surface, I had everything I once dreamed of: financial freedom, independence, the ability to finally live on my own terms. But inside, I felt like the walls were closing in. It wasn't just the betrayal itself. It was the silence that followed. My uncle carried on as though nothing had happened. My parents, instead of standing by me, treated my anger as an overreaction. And the rest of the family either avoided the subject or acted like I was being selfish for not sharing. The bank froze the fraudulent transfer, thankfully, and they assured me that my uncle hadn't gotten a penny, but that did little to ease the sting. I had to meet with lawyers, sign affidavits, and prove my own identity against the false one he'd created. Sitting across from professionals in crisp suits, explaining how my own uncle had tried to steal from me, was humiliating in a way I can't quite describe. Every time I spoke the words he forged my signature, it felt like I was confessing a weakness, a shame that somehow belonged to me instead of him. I started avoiding family gatherings entirely. The thought of sitting at the same table with people who would justify theft as family obligation was unbearable. Invitations piled up in my inbox: holiday dinners, birthdays, barbecues. I deleted them without responding. One day, my mother called, her voice sharp. "Ethan, you can't just cut everyone off. People are starting to talk. It looks bad when you act this way." I bit my tongue because what I wanted to say was, "It looked bad when your brother tried to steal from me, too." Instead, I just muttered something about being busy and ended the call quickly. Isolation became my default. Friends had drifted away during the years I'd built my startup. And now, with my family siding against me, I had no one left to lean on. Nights blurred together, me sitting alone in my apartment, staring at the city lights outside my window, the silence pressing down like a weight. I had the money to fill the void with distractions, luxury vacations, expensive toys, but none of it appealed to me. What was the point if the people closest to me saw me as nothing but a wallet? Sleep didn't come easily. Most nights, I lay awake replaying the funeral in my head, the moment my uncle silenced me, the way his hand gripped my arm: "You'll always be the family failure." The words had been a curse, a brand burned into my identity. And now, even with millions in the bank, I felt like he'd found a way to brand me again, not as a failure this time, but as a resource to be controlled, harvested, drained. The lowest point came one Sunday afternoon when I decided, against my better judgment, to drive out to my parents' house. A part of me still hoped for reconciliation. Maybe if I explained it in person, maybe if I looked them in the eyes, they would finally see. When I walked through the front door, though, my uncle was already there, sitting comfortably on the couch, sipping coffee from a mug like he owned the place. My father barely looked up from the newspaper as he said, "Good. You're here. We were just talking about you." My uncle smiled that same oily smile and gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit down, Ethan. We need to clear the air." Against my instincts, I sat. My mother brought me a cup of coffee, as if that simple gesture could smooth over weeks of silence and betrayal. My uncle leaned forward. "I know you were upset about the bank thing," he began, his tone patronizing. "But you've got to understand, I was just looking out for the family. You've got more than you need, Ethan. Don't you think it's time to give back?" I stared at him, too stunned to speak. He didn't even deny it. He admitted to forging my name like it was nothing, like it was some minor misunderstanding rather than a crime. And worse, my parents sat there nodding, not horrified, not outraged, just complicit. Something inside me cracked. Then I realized no apology was ever coming, no acknowledgement of the wrong they'd done. To them, I would always be either the failure or the resource, never the person, never the son. I left without touching the coffee, without saying goodbye. I got in my car and drove until the houses thinned out into empty roads, the fields stretching on either side. My chest felt hollow, my hands numb on the steering wheel. For the first time in years, I cried, rage, grief, exhaustion spilling out until I had to pull over just to breathe. That night, sitting in my apartment with swollen eyes and a raw throat, I made a quiet promise to myself. I wasn't going to keep playing the role they had written for me. If I stayed silent, if I kept letting them push me down, then they would win. And I couldn't let that happen, not again. But I also knew I couldn't strike back impulsively. Not yet. They were too comfortable, too sure of themselves. If I lashed out now, they'd just twist it into more proof that I was difficult, ungrateful, the problem. No, my revenge had to be careful, methodical. I had to let them walk deeper into their own arrogance until the floor dropped out from under them. So, I waited. I watched. And for the first time in my life, I stopped caring about their approval. After that night, something shifted in me. The grief and exhaustion that had nearly broken me gave way to a steadier, colder kind of energy. I stopped waiting for their validation, stopped hoping for some grand moment of reconciliation that would never come. Instead, I turned inward and asked myself a question I'd never really considered before: if their approval doesn't matter, what would I do with my life purely for me? The answer surprised me. I poured myself back into work, but this time, it wasn't about proving them wrong. It wasn't about chasing some abstract victory over the voices that had always called me a failure. It was about building something sustainable, something meaningful. I partnered with a few trusted colleagues I'd met during the startup days, people who had believed in my ideas before they were worth millions. We started developing new projects, investing in smaller companies with potential. Slowly, I realized I wasn't just a one-hit wonder. I had a knack for seeing possibilities where others didn't. The more I leaned into that, the more doors opened. By the time I turned 29, I had stakes in 3 growing businesses. One was an app that streamlined medical scheduling, another a green energy startup, and the third a niche logistics platform. Each required long hours and careful risk-taking, but the payoff wasn't just financial, it was personal. I was finally surrounding myself with people who valued my input, not my wallet. And as my success grew, so did my freedom. I bought a townhouse in a quiet neighborhood away from the noise of the city. I traveled, not for luxury, but for perspective. Standing in the crowded markets of Marrakesh, walking along the cliffs in Ireland, hiking through forests in Japan, I felt alive in a way I never had before. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving or proving myself. I was living. But while I was building myself up, my family kept circling. The calls never fully stopped, though I ignored most of them. When I did pick up, usually by accident, it was always the same script: your cousin needs help with tuition. Your aunt's medical bills are piling up. We were thinking of starting a family business, and you could really make it happen. Each time, I shut it down with polite vagueness, careful not to give them anything solid. Still, I could sense their growing frustration. Without access to me, their plans dried up. My uncle, especially, grew bolder in his attempts to insert himself into my life. He showed up uninvited once more, this time at a restaurant where I was meeting an investor. He acted as though he had been involved in my success from the beginning, trying to leverage my credibility to impress the man across the table. I had to excuse myself and pull my uncle aside, hissing through clenched teeth that if he ever did that again, he'd regret it. He just smirked, like he knew he still had time to wear me down. But what he didn't know was that while he was circling me, I was quietly circling back. With every business deal I closed, with every step forward I took, I wasn't just growing wealth, I was building influence. I began donating to organizations my family had ties to, but always anonymously. I supported scholarships at the very universities my cousins hoped to attend. I gained quiet connections with people in the community, lawyers, business leaders, even a few in politics. It wasn't about flaunting anything. It was about planting seeds. The turning point came one evening at a networking event. A man approached me, introducing himself as a financial advisor who had once worked with my uncle. He spoke casually, but his words carried weight. "James has been overextending himself," he said, referring to my uncle. "A few risky investments, some debts he hasn't exactly been upfront about. Just thought you should know." I tucked that information away, careful not to show how much it lit a spark inside me. My uncle, so smug, so sure of his own control, was overreaching. He had cracks in his armor, and while I was building strength quietly, he was growing reckless loudly. That imbalance was everything I needed. By the time I turned 30, the contrast was undeniable. I was thriving, financially, emotionally, socially. My network was strong, my projects successful, and my confidence steady. My uncle, meanwhile, was still trying to bully and manipulate his way into relevance, unaware that his foundation was crumbling. The irony wasn't lost on me. At my grandmother's funeral, he had silenced me, branding me the family failure. Now, years later, I had more power than he could ever imagine. And he was the one stumbling, desperate, needing what I had. I didn't confront him, not yet. Revenge, I realized, wasn't about striking the moment you were angry. It was about waiting until the ground beneath your enemy was already soft, then applying just the right amount of pressure to make it collapse. And when the moment came, I would be ready. The opportunity presented itself almost too perfectly, as though fate had been biding its time, watching me gather strength before finally laying the next card on the table. By now, my life had taken on a rhythm that felt steady and controlled. I was no longer scrambling, no longer reacting to the chaos my family stirred up. I was observing, waiting, preparing. It started with a call from a former classmate, Daniel, who had become an attorney specializing in corporate fraud and estate law. We met for coffee just to catch up, but the conversation drifted toward my family almost inevitably. I hadn't planned on venting, but the words poured out, the forgery, the entitled requests, the constant pressure. Daniel listened without judgment, then leaned back in his chair with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he said, "forgery like that isn't just a family dispute. It's a crime. If he tried to move funds under your name, that could carry serious consequences. Prison time even." The word prison lingered in my head like a bell tolling in the distance. I'd known what my uncle did was illegal, but I hadn't fully grasped the severity. I'd let it slide at the time, thinking confrontation was enough, but hearing it laid out in legal terms from someone who understood the system made the reality sharper. Then Daniel added something that made my pulse quicken. "If he's reckless enough to forge your signature, odds are he's been reckless in other areas, too. People like that usually don't stop at one stunt." That same week, I got another piece of the puzzle. One of my newer business partners mentioned, almost in passing, that my uncle had approached him about a family investment opportunity. Apparently, my uncle had been dangling my name, claiming I was backing his ventures, using my credibility to lure in potential investors. I felt my jaw tighten as he explained. It wasn't just about money anymore. My uncle was leveraging my success as if it were his own, dragging my name into schemes I had nothing to do with. If one of those ventures collapsed, and from the sound of it, they almost certainly would, my reputation could take a hit right alongside his. That night, I sat at my desk, documents spread out in front of me, scribbling notes and connections in the margins. My uncle had debts. He had a habit of forging and exaggerating. He was using my name without consent. He was reckless. All of it was a web waiting to collapse. But here's where the real shift happened. For the first time, I had the tools to do something about it. Through my businesses, I had relationships with attorneys, accountants, even investigators. I wasn't the powerless kid being silenced at a funeral anymore. I was someone with influence, someone who could pull strings. Instead of confronting him directly, I started gathering quietly. I asked Daniel to look into some public records, deeds, liens, property holdings. I requested discreet background checks on companies my uncle claimed to be running. The picture that emerged was even worse than I imagined: unpaid debts, defaulted loans, business registrations with no actual operations, and whispers of investors already asking questions about where their money had gone. It was almost poetic. The man who had branded me a failure was himself failing on every front. Only he didn't know I knew. The more I uncovered, the clearer my path became. I didn't have to invent a trap. He had already built one for himself. All I had to do was guide him further in, letting him believe he was in control until the moment came to pull the rug out from under him. But there was one final piece I needed before I could move forward: proximity. I had to get close enough to him again that he would drop his guard, that he'd let me see the full scope of his arrogance. And for that, I needed patience. So, I accepted an invitation. It was my mother who extended it, calling one evening with that same clipped tone she always used when she was trying to guilt me. "Ethan, your uncle's hosting a family barbecue next month. It would mean a lot if you came. People are still whispering about how you've been distant." Under normal circumstances, I would have declined, but this time I agreed. When she hung up, I sat in the quiet of my townhouse, staring at the city skyline outside my window. For the first time in years, I felt calm at the thought of walking into one of those gatherings, because now I wasn't coming as the family failure or the reluctant provider. I was coming as someone with knowledge, leverage, and the beginnings of a plan. My uncle thought he had written the story of who I was, but he had no idea I'd picked up the pen. The day of the barbecue was hot, the kind of humid summer afternoon where the air itself feels heavy. As I drove up to my uncle's house, I couldn't help but think of how many times I'd pulled into the same driveway as a kid, always bracing myself for some offhand insult or joke at my expense. This time, though, I didn't feel small. I felt steady, focused. The yard was already packed with relatives when I arrived. Kids ran through sprinklers, adults hovered around grills and coolers, and the usual chorus of laughter rose over it all. As I stepped out of my car, heads turned. Conversations paused for a beat too long before picking back up, louder and forced. They all knew what I'd become, though not a single one would admit how badly they wanted to share in it. My uncle spotted me almost immediately. He strutted over with that fake grin plastered on his face, his arms spread as though I were some long-lost son returning home. "Ethan," he boomed, "there's my boy. Knew you wouldn't let family down." I let him hug me, though every instinct in my body recoiled. His grip was tight, rehearsed, like he was trying to perform affection for the audience of cousins and aunts watching us. I pulled back, smiled politely, and handed him a small bottle of wine, a peace offering on the surface, though really just camouflage. The afternoon unfolded predictably. My uncle held court at the center of it all, retelling embellished stories of family history, inserting himself as the hero at every turn. Every time someone asked about my work, he jumped in before I could answer, framing my success as if it were somehow his doing. "I always told Ethan to keep pushing," he'd say, patting my back with just enough force to sting. He needed tough love, and look, it paid off. I nodded, smiled, let him play his part. Because what no one knew was that I hadn't come to defend myself. I had come to let him dig his own grave. After dinner, as the sun dipped and people settled into lawn chairs with drinks, my uncle pulled me aside. His voice dropped low, confidential. "Ethan, I've got something big, a business opportunity, but it's family only. I want you in on it." He led me to the garage, where he had laid out glossy pamphlets and fake-looking charts across a folding table. He spoke quickly, throwing around buzzwords about real estate flips, overseas partnerships, guaranteed returns. I listened, asking just enough questions to keep him talking. Then came the hook. "Now, we'll need seed money to get started, just $100,000 or so. But with you backing us, investors will flock. This is legacy-level wealth, Ethan. The family will never forget it." I studied him for a long moment, the same man who had silenced me at my grandmother's funeral, who had tried to forge my name, who had used my success like a prop in his circus. And now he was pitching me a scam he didn't realize I already had evidence of. I leaned forward slightly, keeping my tone calm. "Uncle James, I'll think about it, but if we're doing this right, I'll need to look at the paperwork first, financials, registrations, all of it. You understand?" He grinned, mistaking my measured words for agreement. Of course. I'll get you everything you need. You'll see, it's solid." What he didn't know was that I'd already gathered most of those documents through Daniel. What he didn't know was that the investments he thought he was hiding were already on record, loans unpaid, assets overstated, liabilities buried under creative bookkeeping. What he didn't know was that by handing me his pitch, he was handing me the rope to tie the knot. Over the next few weeks, I played along. I let him send me drafts, proposals, even investor lists. Each time, I forwarded them to my lawyer and accountant. Each time, they uncovered another crack, another fabrication. By the time we were done, we had a file thicker than a phone book, proof of fraud, deception, and a trail of financial recklessness that could ruin him. And then came the moment to act. Instead of confronting him privately, I invited him to meet me in a more official setting, a quiet office downtown, neutral ground. He arrived wearing a too-tight suit and a smug grin, no doubt imagining the check I was about to write. He even brought a pen, pulling it from his jacket with a flourish as he sat across from me. I let him talk for a while, spinning his fantasies, before sliding the folder across the desk. "I think you should take a look," I said evenly. He opened it, scanned the first few pages, and his face shifted, confusion first, then irritation, then a flicker of fear. He looked up at me, his mouth tightening. "Where did you get this?" "Public record," I said calmly. "And some of it straight from you. Your pitches, your claims. Every lie you've told investors, every debt you've hidden, it's all in there." His jaw clenched. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," I cut in, my voice sharp now. "You tried to steal from me. You used my name to prop up your scams, and you thought I'd just keep swallowing it like I always did. But here's the truth, I'm done being quiet." He leaned back, trying to recover his swagger. "So what? You'll go to the police? That'll ruin the family name." He thought I wanted to be seen as some sort of hero for standing against my own bloodline. But I met his stare and told him I didn't need to run to the police, not yet, anyway, because I still had options. Those investors he cheated would love nothing more than to get their hands on this, and regulators would be equally thrilled. I warned him clearly that if he tried to drag my name into his schemes again, even once, I wouldn't hesitate. For the first time in my life, I saw something real in his eyes, fear. He tried to cover it up, but his hand betrayed him, trembling slightly as he closed the folder. He muttered that I wouldn't dare, and I gave him a calm smile and said, "Try me." I let the silence stretch, let the weight of his own lies crush him. Then I stood, straightened my jacket, and walked away, leaving him speechless for once. The fallout came even faster than I expected. Within a month, whispers traveled through the family like wildfire. My uncle had gone eerily quiet. The man who once puffed his chest at every gathering, who loved to boast about his ventures while throwing sly insults, stopped showing his face. He ignored calls, declined invitations, disappeared. When I finally heard from my cousin Ryan, his voice was low and uneasy as he admitted his dad was dealing with financial stuff. He didn't say the rest, but I already knew, the walls were closing in. Investors my uncle had strung along were demanding answers, and the file I had built made its way to the right people, not by accident, but because I had placed it in the hands of one furious investor already preparing to sue. From there, everything snowballed. Letters from lawyers stacked up at my uncle's door. Hidden debts surfaced. The shiny front he had constructed collapsed piece by piece. The man once celebrated as the golden talker, the same one who silenced me at my grandmother's funeral, had become the subject of hushed conversations. By Easter dinner, the shift in the family was impossible to miss. My uncle was absent. My aunt arrived alone, her smile brittle, her eyes scanning nervously. No one dared speak his name, but the silence was deafening. For years, I had been branded the failure, the disappointment, the one mocked and dismissed. Yet now, as I carved ham at the table, I felt their eyes turn toward me with something new, not pity, not ridicule, but respect laced with unease. It wasn't about money. It was about power. They saw clearly that I was no longer someone to push aside. I wasn't the boy forced into silence. I was a man who had reclaimed his voice, his strength, his dignity, and I was unafraid to use it. The final blow came months later when my uncle declared bankruptcy. His businesses crumbled, his house went up for sale, and his name was dragged through the mud in every circle that once praised him. He tried once to reach out, leaving a shaky voicemail about family sticking together. I never called back. I didn't need to. My revenge wasn't in shouting or dragging him through court or watching his empire collapse. It was in the silence, the same silence he once forced on me at my grandmother's funeral now swallowed him whole. One evening, standing on my balcony with city lights sprawling beneath me, I thought of her. I thought of the tribute I never gave, the words I was told not to say because I'd embarrassed the family. I closed my eyes, breathed deep, and whispered them into the night, not for approval, not for anyone else to hear, but for her and for me. And in that moment, I felt free. The one they called a failure had become the voice. Silence itself had become my weapon. And the man who believed he could bury me with words was now buried by his own.